Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see you here tonight. I didn't know how many to cater for, whether it would be 5 or 50, but for those who are here, make you welcome. And I acknowledge a couple of guests, and I specifically invited some of the local sail makers who make sails for our yachts, and I'd just like to acknowledge Ben from Quantum. Welcome. And we also got Chris from Doyle and Andrew from Ullman. Anyone else? I had a couple of other people said that they would come, but not here. So look, I think this is a really important night for us because it's a really important night for us because the rule is widely used, as you know. It's used internationally, and as a matter of fact, I've had comments and apologies from people as far away as New Zealand. Simon Hull put in an apology for tonight, as did Mark Pescott and Alan Carbidine from Phuket. So it is used widely, and so we take the responsibility of this rule very seriously. So this latest review is well overdue because I've been receiving lots of correspondence from boat owners over the last year or two, and so it's taken a little bit longer to bring this latest review to fruition, but we're here and it's done, and I'm hoping that it works. Yeah. I understand that it's not going to work for everybody. I've been racing under various handicaps rules for nearly 40 years, and there is always some boats that are outside the parameters that don't do well. So with that, I'd just like to explain the format of tonight. We'll go through the process, and we have our panel of Alistair Noble, who's our Vice Commodore and also chairs the OMR Review Committee. Mike Hodges, our Vice Commodore. Did I say Vice? Yeah. Rear correction. Alistair, our Rear Commodore. And of course, multi-hull legend Jeff and life member Jeff Cruz. So these guys have worked extremely hard over the last 6 to 8 months, and I personally want to thank them for the time that they've put in, because it's one of those jobs that sometimes becomes thankless, and I really appreciate the time that you guys have put in. Okay, so we will go through the process of explaining the rule, and then we'll invite questions from the floor. And there have been a few questions come in via email, which Alistair is aware of and will probably include in his presentation. And then after questions, we'll break and have supper, and of course you're welcome to stay around and have a bit of a chat about the rule and other things, as us boating people like to do. So I'll now hand over to Jeff Cruz, who's going to give you a little bit of the history of OMR.
Well, just to put you in the picture with how the history of ratings has developed from our club. Back in the 60s and probably through from the mid-60s to the mid-70s, our rating rules were developed by people in the club itself. A fellow called Bill Wilson, who was an engineer or something, was given the task of coming up with a decent rating to rate multi-hulls. Bill explained it all to us. I was only quite a youngster then. I'm still only a youngster, as you know, but I was even younger then. And Bill decided that there were two parts to a rule. One was the part that made you go fast, and the other was the part that stopped you from going fast. So he worked out that, the bigger the sail area, the faster you were going to go. The heavier the boat, the slower you were going to go. The more windage, water drag and all that sort of thing. And he came up with a rule that seemed to be pretty good, seemed to cover all the factors. In those days, all the boats were pretty similar in that they were all plywood, bit of fiberglass perhaps, all about the same size, you know, within reason. There weren't any really small boats, there weren't any really big boats. Unfortunately, the rule never worked all very well. It always seemed to be the first boat there seemed to win on handicap as well. And you'll see that if you go back into the early Gladstone races, that the winning boat was often the winner on handicap as well. So we realised after some time that this wasn't working very successfully. Everyone sort of accepted it. In the mid-80s, no, sorry, it was probably more like the mid-70s, late 70s, things got a little bit different. Boats changed. They started building faster boats aimed at racing rather than cruising, or with a bit of racing thrown in. From a space yacht scientist in America called Hugo Myers, I think it was, and a couple of his cronies, and he was a multi-hull enthusiast as well, came up with a rule which they called OMR, International Offshore Multi-Hull Rule. And this rule was pretty complicated. Computers were just coming into their own at the time. Not too many household computers, but there were computers around the place. And our first computer programs were on tape, paper tape or something that went through the machine. Pretty complicated stuff. The rule was a pretty sophisticated thing, went for about 4 pages of foolscap in calculations, calculated absolutely everything. But unfortunately, it wasn't all that successful. It was certainly better than the original rule that we had, in that not only the fastest boats didn't always win on handicap, but it had some little quirk. If you looked at a bell-shaped curve in the middle of the fleet where the moderate boats were, if you were one side of that top bit, you got a very good rating. If you're on the other side of it, you had no chance of winning, and there was not much we could do about it. But we persevered with that rule for quite some time with minor alterations. Also, that's where we got the parameters that we measure the boats with now. We used to try and measure the width of the hulls and the wetted surface areas underneath and all sorts of things, which became quite not only difficult but easy to muck about with. People put blisters on their hulls to make them wider at the measurement points to get a better handicap, things like that. And it was obvious that we needed to do something that wasn't quite as specific as that. The other problem too was that the parameters for sail measurements, and this will interest sail makers no doubt, was that those days the measurement for sails was done in the same way as it was for monohulls, where you have a sort of a hole in the sky that you could put a sail in. There was a wire there and a mast there and a boom there, and you could fit a certain space sail in there, and so that's what you were handicapped on. And so people were able to make stretchier sails, or you get some sort of a shape and just get some sort of an advantage that way. Sail makers know all about that, I don't. Anyway, that rule persisted for quite a while. But in the late 90s, a bloke called Alan Mitchell, who was a club commodore, had a bit of a scientific bent, and he started looking at a rule from Holland, the Texel rule, which was actually developed for off-the-beach cats, but not just one group of off-the-beach cats. It tried to come up with a system that would fit a whole lot of different styles of off-the-beach cats, and it seemed to be very successful over there. When Alan looked at it, he realised that the same sort of parameters that we used for the measurements was what was used for IOMR. And after he'd sort of had a good look at it, he felt that it would be an ideal thing for us and might correct some of the anomalies that we had with the OMR. So we ran a few tests with it, and it did seem to do that. Alan developed a spreadsheet so that all this happened at once, and it was a fair bit less complicated than the other rule. And what it also did, it actually measured, although I think that might have been something that he and I decided to do, was to actually measure the sales rather than a space that a sale could fit in. We decided to actually measure the sale itself in area, so that if you had a 150 square foot jib, that's what you got rated on, and so on. At this time too, we suddenly found that we didn't just have cruiser races and sort of performance cruisers. We were suddenly getting out and out racing machines coming onto the scene as well, and that required a little bit more thought, because obviously if you've got an out and out racing machine, you expect to perform, and you're going to have top quality sales and the best of equipment. This is going to give you an advantage. We couldn't see too many ways around that either. Anyway, that's how the OMR developed. The various parameters that were put in were tweaked from time to time by various committees to try and improve things. And as new sales come out, like screeches for example, a formula was worked out for them. We've had some pretty clever people in the club who've run these things through statistical analysis over lots of different races, just to see what would happen if this changed and that changed and the other changed. And the idea was to try and, keep the results as close as possible, but I'll leave that for other people to tell you about. Well, I should sort of go back to the philosophy of the rule, because the Texel rule wasn't meant to reward the best sailors. The best sailors go for one design. Everyone has exactly the same boat, so the best guys come to the front because they just sail better. It's nothing to do with the rig or whatever. It may be something to do with how you tweak the rig, but it's not because everything has to be exactly the same. It also wasn't meant to be about the best boat or the most efficient boat that you could fit in a certain box, like a box rule, for example. Box rule rewards, with a box rule you have a set of parameters. You can have a mast this big, and a boat this long, and a boat this wide. Everyone has the same boat. You can do whatever else you like with it. OMR wasn't meant to do that either. That probably means, who's got the most money to throw at a boat for the most development wins the races. OMR tried to be all things to all people, and probably failed miserably at that. It's almost impossible. What we've always tried to do right from the start is provide a framework for people to develop a boat, develop their crew skills, use the best materials they can, and sail as well as they can, and have a reasonable chance at competing at the level, not necessarily the top level, but at a level that where they have a bunch of other people to sail against. I think it's quite a difficult thing now because of the development of sailcloths and other gear to try and give everyone an equal chance. It's like if you have a box 20 foot long that's square at the ends with a mast in the middle, and you compare that with a long skinny hull that's 20 foot long with a mast in the middle, it's always going to go faster. You can't expect a box to sail at the same as a nicely shaped hull, even in any conditions. it's going to change as the wind changes. You know, the box might go okay in very light conditions and so on. Very difficult to make it work over a large numbers of conditions. So we've now got to the point where I guess we have a group of boats that are right at the cutting edge and are going very quickly. They almost have their own set of races, and for this reason most of the clubs have divided the races into divisions, so that you have a division for the top guys, another division for the next group, if you like, who are perhaps more interested in cruiser racing than out-and-out racing. And hopefully that allows everybody in the club to get to a position where they've got someone to race against, someone to beat. They may not be the best in OMR total, but they can be the best in OMR in their group. So I'll hand over to Mike to tell you how we've tried to get to that.
Thank you, Cruzy. Well, this is the third review of OMR that I've been involved with, and the philosophy has changed in this review, in that the first two reviews were centred around trying to make the results, the span of the results, closer. In other words, less distance between the first boat and the last boat. And you know, that was done by mathematically running hundreds of races and trying to work out what things you could change that would get the results closer together. And it was there was a deliberate philosophy not to actually look at individual boats, and that worked to an extent, but it brought the results closer together. This time it was decided that we should actually look at groups of boats, not individual boats, but look at groups of boats, and try and work out what was going to make those groups closer to other groups. And by groups I mean, bridge deck cats versus trimarans versus catamarans and short boats. Peter, for you, sure.
Size doesn't count.
Sorry?
Size doesn't count.
And we had a good opportunity to do that, because last year at Airlie Beach and Hamilton Island, all those groups of boats raced together and raced on the same course, which wasn't what normally happened. What normally happened at regattas would be that there'd be three divisions, and so you didn't get the mix of boats racing together. And when they raced in divisions, they raced different courses, so you couldn't compare data. But last year we had two regattas and 13 races, I think, was it, Al?
Yeah,
13 races where all the boats raced together on the same course, and that gave us the opportunity to look at the boats as groups, and what might be done to make them more equal under OMR. And and I think we've done that. So that's the first time that I'm aware of that we've gone down that track. Alistair, did a great job with the mathematics. And I'm probably, like most of you, I can look at it and go, gee, that's nice, but I don't really understand what's going on. whereas Alistair, he understands all that. So this review has, taken it a different path to the previous ones. And we've also been listening to what people out on the racetrack are telling us, and we've taken that into account with coming up with this new philosophy. Now I'll hand you over to Alistair to talk about the detail.
So this is where we switch to the computer and start to get a bit more technical than the philosophy and the history. So building on, I guess, what Mike was saying, really what we were trying to do in this review, and I guess the philosophy that Mike described in previous reviews of trying to reduce the coefficient of variation is a very good philosophy overall when you're trying to get everyone into an equal footing. And I think those reviews that did that certainly reduced the spread of boats considerably and brought everyone onto a fairly equal playing field. But there's a risk if you keep going down that path of just trying to reduce the variation, you actually start compensating for things that you shouldn't actually be compensating for in the first place. So the OMR is supposed to compensate for physical characteristics of the boat, but it's not supposed to compensate for how well that boat is sailed or what sort of decisions are made around a racetrack and things like that. So as you start trying to bring the coefficient of variation too fine, you actually have to start compensating for those sort of factors, which is not what the OMR is about. And it could be argued that it had almost started to go too far already. And if you look at one design as sort of the basis for that, even in a large fleet of one design yachts where everyone's sort of cutting edge sailors, there's a huge spread in the finishing times of those boats. They don't all finish together, even though all the boats are the same. So at some point, the skill of the crew, the skill of the decisions that are being made, the luck of the racetrack or whatever where they happen to be has to come into it. And if you try to make a formula that brings everyone close together, you actually start accounting for those sort of factors. If somebody always gets lucky, then they'll start to, the formula will start to reflect that. So that's why, I guess, when we stepped back at the start of this process, we tried to work out, well, how actually can we take a bit of a different approach at it? So the approach is really laid out in the slide here. What we tried to do is identify what are the anomalies in the existing rule, and using the feedback of people out there using the rule to assist with that. And then we examined the underlying elements of the rating system to see how we could address those anomalies. And as Mike said, that by its nature starts to address groups of boats who all share the same sort of characteristic. As Mike said, good data allowed us to really see the impact of that, and we could look at how that data compared on the old rule and how it compared under the new rule. We did quite a lot of parallel sort of analysis before we actually released it into the wild sort of thing. And I guess at the start, I should say as well, this review isn't trying to fix everything in the OMR. The OMR is a development rule, goes through periodic reviews, and this is just a step in that journey. There will be future reviews that fix it further and it will continue to develop. We haven't tried to fix absolutely everything in the rule in this one go. We've tried to move it in the direction that we think it should go and then assess whether we've moved it far enough, too far, or need to bring something else in at a later point. And then at the same time, there are some administrative changes that we made just to the background of how the system really works, not specifically to do with the formula itself. So if you group it up as to what the general feedback we were receiving, there's sort of 4 points that really came out of that. And so this is based on feedback from people. We sent out, at the start of the review, we sent out an email to everyone saying that we were doing a review, requesting feedback, requesting data, preferably, to support that feedback. And the general consensus we received was that there's a perceived or an actual bias towards cruising multi-hulls, specifically bridge deck catamarans tended to be winning more than a representative share of the races that they were in compared to out and out racing type machines who you would expect to be placing well. There were apparent discrepancies in the sail efficiencies between different boats, with not too much of a physical difference between the boat itself, but a calculated difference that favoured one or the other quite strongly. There was a perceived, again, difficulty for smaller multi-hulls to be competitive under the rule. And the other feedback we've received along the way is that there's a need to rate traditionally downwind sails that can be used upwind more appropriately under the rules. So obviously that's people using screechers upwind. So that's the sort of four main points that we heard. What we did in the rule is we sort of, as I said, looked at the elements, and what we could see in the underlying data was some things that we knew or felt were to be wrong in the rule, and really that was drag factors, the rotating, and I'll go through these individually with specifics. The impact a rotating mast had, the sail efficiencies, and the factors around the length of the boat. So they're the four main modifications we've made, and now I'll talk about each one in turn. So hoping that people can sort of see the detail in this slide up on the screen. What we're looking at here is the drag factors. Now and I guess Jeff would attest to this, when the drag factors were originally put in the sheet, there wasn't really any data. It was hard to actually say how much better or worse one type of propeller was to another. Since then, though, there's been a lot of tank testing and a lot of field testing, and a lot of people have actually gone out and been testing this stuff around the world. And with the beauty of the internet, we have access to all of that. So this graph represents some test work that was done at the Clyde University, and it's very relevant to what we're looking at. It's in sailing vessels and the drag factors of propellers. And it's quite clear. You can see the lower flat graphs along the bottom are the ones with feathering and folding propellers, and they really, the modern designs of those things are so efficient that there's virtually negligible drag out of those propellers compared to a fixed bladed prop. But what we had in the OMR at the time doesn't reflect that. So in the OMR, two fixed propellers had a drag factor of 0.9625, two folding or feathering propellers had a drag factor of 0.97, compared to boats with no engines in the water that had one. So you can see that both of them were being affected pretty much equally, to around 3% sort of thing, where really the data says that the feathering and folding propellers should be hardly affected at all, and the fixed ones have a big impact. So that was the first step that we took. So the suggestion and the running some data alongside all of this, we indicated that the best solution was to bring the folding and feathering props to 0.99, so really reflecting that they don't have as much impact as was originally in the formula. So that's the drag factors. Now, I guess happy to take questions at any stage, but it may be more logical to run through it all and then have questions in general at the end. But if anyone has a specific question in their mind at the time, feel free to jump in. That's good. I'll keep moving. The next thing that we looked at was rotating mast. So while investigating the impact of rotating mast and how it was addressed in the formulas, it actually uncovered a very slight, I will say, error in how it was treated before. And what had happened in a previous review is that it had moved, when measuring the aspect ratio and therefore the dimensions of the mast compared to the sail, had moved from using LPM to using E, but left in the dimension of the mast an angled calculation similar to the angle that the LPM makes, the LPM being the right angle in the mainsail coming from the gooseneck to the left. So that was addressed. Take that out. What that actually did is increase the impact of rotating mast, but only very, very slightly. So that wasn't necessarily heading down the path we wanted to go, but at least it was fixing up an error in the calculation. So then what we did is currently the mast calculation is that it's the length of the mast times the mast circumference times 0.5. Now the mast circumference obviously is a two-dimensional ellipse, what that does is just say half the circumference becomes the area of the mast that's exposed to the wind. But obviously that's not right. If you fold an oval or an ellipse down, it'll be a line that's longer than the mast is actually wide. So looking at the geometry of all of that, the suggestion and the recommendation was to make it 0.375. When we looked at that in the data, that seemed to support and seems to give so it's quite a reduced impact of a rotating mast and more in line with probably the performance gain that people are actually getting. Now, this one's probably fairly close to me. I had a rotating mast and I now have a fixed mast. It wasn't to try to address any anomaly in the rating. My mast fell over and it was easiest to put it back as a fixed one. But along the way, I was really able to understand that I wasn't getting the performance benefit that the rotating mast formula indicated that I should have been getting. And talking to other sailors, there was general agreement on that. So that's the change that was made in the rotating mast. And really fairly small changes from each of these factors. And as we'll talk about at the end, it depends whether this factor impacts on the particular boat that you might be worried about as to whether it gains or loses out of each one. But boats that are impacted by more of these factors than others will gain more or less than ones who don't have any of these sort of features. The next one was sail efficiencies. So sail efficiencies weren't in the original OMR system. They had been introduced at a point, and it was in line with what Mike was saying to try to bring that spread of coefficiency of variation and reduced across the race fleet. Now, it wasn't necessarily done for too many technical reasons other than to really just reduce that spread of boats, and this was seen to be a way that appeared to do that and was used and was then fine-tuned and worked on quite a bit through the reviews and was seen to be useful at those points in time. I guess what we're saying now is that when we start to analyse recent race results in the same way, that efficiency being in there doesn't actually improve the results anymore. Things have changed from when that was being done to now, such that the sail efficiencies actually aren't doing what they did in the previous reviews. They aren't actually bringing the boats closer anymore. And what they're tending to do is actually cause anomalies where some boats have what are calculated to be inefficient sails that in practice seem to be very efficient. And the rating was favouring those sort of boats. So again, that's what we've looked at there. We looked at a range of steps to make in the efficiencies to reduce it by a bit, to halve it, to quarter it, something like that. But at the end of the day, it really didn't impact the results too much. And the best way we could represent the data in the recent races was actually to take the efficiencies out completely. And I think what that reflects really is that modern sail design can make what in theory might be an inefficient aspect ratio, it can still make quite an efficient sail to power that boat through modern sail design. Now obviously at the ends of the spectrum that's not going to be true, but most of the boats that are out there racing these days have got quite effective sail rigs and sail plans. You don't have too many of the sort of old plywood bay boats that are trying to race with quite an inefficient rig sailing around. And the sail efficiencies had some anomalies as well. I mean, you could actually, in theory, get a sail that was more than 100% efficient under the way that the previous calculations were made. So when you started to get to the top end of the boats, the efficiencies seemed very unreasonable compared to the efficiencies that were being imposed in lesser boats. So, as I say, the change that actually made the best impact in the results was to remove the efficiencies at all. The next one we looked at was small boats versus large boats. So I guess what I've tried to put here is a couple of sort of truisms that small multi-hulls generally don't have the top speed potential that a large multi-hull has. It comes down to waterline length and all those sort of things. I mean, there are exceptions, obviously. I mean, you can get absolute rocket ships but in a small boat, but on the whole, a small boat isn't going to be able to generate the sort of top speeds. I mean, you've got some of these larger boats going around now doing 35, 40 knots and things like that. you're never really going to get a small multi-hull up to those sort of speeds. Small multi-hulls are also more impacted by the chop and the swell, which, while the OMR is not really trying to equalise race conditions and things like that, it's a given that in most races, in the majority of races, the small boats are going to get knocked around a little bit more by the chop and the swell. And again, that means that they're not going to be able to generate that speed potential that they may have, and particularly in the offshore events. And the OMR is specifically catering to offshore events. So looking at, and this goes back to all the previous reviews, always in the analysis of the race results, when there was a fleet of small boats versus a fleet of large boats, the data fitted a lot better if the small boats had a coefficient, had a factor for the rated length of about 0.29 versus the large boats with 0.3. So I guess I should just step back. Fundamentally, the rule of OMR is that there's a rated length which has a factor, there's a rated weight which has a factor, and there's a rated sail area which has a factor, and they're multiplied together. So the larger the factor, the more influence that component is going to have out of the three, so power to weight type calculation. So it's quite clear when you look at the data that small boats generally tend to, even comparing amongst themselves, work better with 0.29 than 0.3, which sounds like a small change, but it actually makes a couple of % difference in the final calculation. So what we looked at, and I guess with computers and things getting better now, we were able to actually put a variable factor in, instead of just having one number that was supposed to address all the boats, build in that variable factor to give the smaller boats a helping hand in a way into that formula and into an area that they probably suited them better anyway. So how that was done, it became a bit mathematical. It was really just about fitting a model that had the right sort of shape that could then be built into the formula to calculate that out. And the shape needed to be smooth, and it needed to not have a disconnect when the normal rating took over. So the graph up there shows the shape that is in the model now, and this is the shape as it relates to that RL factor. So a boat right at the lower end of that will have an RL factor of 0.29. A boat anywhere from about 11 metres longer will have an RL factor of 0.3. People in the middle will have somewhere between that. The impact of that is that boats over 11 metres see no difference. Boats close to but less than 11 metres will see a negligible change, but as the boats get to the smaller end of those in the database, the change grows to about a 2% reduction in the OMR for those boats. So effectively what that does is gives a bit of a boost to the smaller end of the fleet to bring that playing field hopefully a bit more level in that regard. Now this is a reasonably fundamental change, because up till now the factors have always been just a fixed number for all fleets. So this is quite a difference, and we talked about the philosophy of it quite a bit within the committee, and we think that it's a good way to go, and we'll assess the data and see how it pans out. You'll remember the other anomaly we heard, and you might have seen it was missing from the changes that were made, was upwind screeches. So the issue we have is the OMR really has to be a development rule, and therefore to a degree it lags what people are actually doing, and then uses the data to start to work out how to rate those different aspects. And the rule shouldn't ever penalise somebody for trying to make their boat go faster. So there's quite a few voices out there that we've heard that say that should just be banned. You should stop people from using that because that's cheating and that's a loophole in the rule. The rule isn't about telling people what they can and can't do with their boats. It's about understanding what people are doing with their boats and then understanding how to rate that equally for them. Now at the moment we just don't have the data on enough boats with upwind screeches to really work that out. The difficulty we have, I mean there are obviously boats in our database that do use upwind screeches, and you could say, well, we've got data for that, but we don't know what size of screecher they use, because all that we measure is the largest screecher, and those boats typically will have more than one screecher. So we don't know the size of the screecher that they're using upwind. So we've put a request back out to all the people who've sort of given that feedback, saying, tell us more, tell us what size screecher people are using upwind, tell us how they're using it, and tell us what you think the actual impact is, because certainly when you look at some of the data and some of the noise we get about the upwind screeches is there's a boat out there that has it and it shouldn't be, but that boat isn't winning and it's not winning on OMR. So what's really the issue with it? And until we get that sort of database building up, and of course there are other boats out there with upwind screeches who are winning on OMR, but the one that we've heard particular noise about hasn't. Try not to get too specific. But so I guess we've parked this for a little bit. We didn't want to hold back the rest of the review that we were doing. We understand that it is something that OMR needs to address, but we need to just wait until we've got more data to really support it. So it's not that this is not being considered, it's just that we're not ready to make the change in this yet, because we don't want to penalise people unnecessarily before we get the data that shows how it's actually working. I mean, there are schools that thought out there that it actually doesn't do people much benefit. Now, obviously, it's only a small group of boats who can do that. It's generally only trimarans who can get the tension that they need to carry the screecher upwind with the loads, and generally only a smaller end of that fleet as well. So we'll sit and sort of reserve judgment on that one a little bit, but there's nothing to stop a change being made as soon as we get enough data that it really indicates where that should be. So I guess what I'm trying to say there is, if you think this is an anomaly in the rule, help us out by trying to help us gather the data and understand how we can actually start to account for it.
Al, was there any thought given there, because we all know some of the boats and some have experimented with it and sometimes we've seen it do really well and other times it's just shit. Is there any thought to having a screecher that you would sign off to say this is a screecher I will never use upwind? As in, I know one class was you couldn't tack.
Yeah.
Otherwise it then became an upwind declared sail.
Yeah, we've thought about that, and I mean, that's ways to do it, but again, the rule isn't about slowing people down, so you don't want to hold people back from what sails they are using, and at the moment, the reality is we just actually don't know what screechers they are using out of their wardrobe. They'll declare the largest screecher into the spreadsheet, but that won't be the one they're going upwind with. Mm-hmm. So when I try to plug the areas in and see, I don't even have the data to look at it. So it's something, and it's probably something we need to enlist the help of the sailmakers a little bit more, because they're probably the ones who are closest to it as to what people are asking for and what they are designing onto boats and what they're managing to achieve, sort of thing, and what sort of benefit they think they're getting out of it. Because the rule does need to account for it in some form, but at the moment that hasn't been addressed as part of this review.
Just thinking off the top of my head, I think in the experience I've had, the boats that it is most successful with are boats with short J's or lacking headsail area. Like you'd never put one on a Mojo that has the rig well aft, but then it gets stung for having a big headsail and fires up early. I think that one of the dangers that you might find further down the track if you target it too much is, it's a development rule. You don't want it to be the guy who builds the lightest boat, the most high-tech boat and throws all the money at it, and you don't want to promote that too much. In a way, the rule has been sort of stifling that a little bit, and I don't mind some of that, but what upwind screechers do is they allow boats that don't power up early, that are maybe a little under canvassed or a little bit on the heavier side, to get a leg up in lighter airs. Now, if you penalise that too heavily, you will push in the favour of highly powered boats and carbon lightweight boats and boats that do power up early through having enough horsepower in their upwind, main and jib from the get-go. So it's incredibly complex, and I think the thing that I've realised after watching you guys go through it is I'm glad I don't have to do any of that, but any change you make, like I remember some of the screecher changes a while ago, the impacts of that will not be obvious straight away. And this looks to be just one of the best ones I've seen, and I support it completely, but I think that people get so fixated on that boat's got that sail or whatever, And if you went down a whole process to pull that back in a check, it's very easy to then open a door that a year or 2 years down the track you realise, oops, we've created a bigger problem. And if the problem is boats costing more, then we've got a real problem as multi-hulls because we'll have less boats.
And the last thing we want to do is disadvantage somebody who's spent a lot of money on his lovely set of sails and have to take it back to the sail maker and say, I'm not allowed to use this sail anymore, can you recut it for me? Now you might like that, but you'd probably say to him, throw it away, you can't use it. Yeah.
As any sailmaker trying to sell one to someone, we know that they will not work or be an advantage for a high output of money. They're an expensive sail to get to work upwind.
Yep.
They need big torque ropes, you know, they need huge tension. So, you know, it is working on a more select group of boats, and yeah, trimarans are more likely for it to work on. And I think that, you know, that's what we do as sailmakers, is we give the best thing for someone's boat, and you know, we're already all going through that process constantly, and I think it's very easy for someone to go, oh, I want, no, he's got a bigger sail than me, I want that, you know, and it's working on his boat, but there's probably more boats that definitely won't work on the boats that will. And I think the boats that it's highly successful on are more likely to already have a bigger screecher, in my view.
Well, you know, the whole OMR rule is fraught with things like that. If you pick on one particular thing on one particular boat and say that boat goes well because of X, it will almost certainly not be true, because it'll be a number of things that make that work on that boat. And if you change that for, you know, take all those things and put them on another boat, the chances are that won't work on that boat. It might be the way that guys sail it, it might be the angles that it's on, it might be the weights. There's so many different variables that you know, it's only by experimentation that people are able to get the best out of their boats, and I think that's what, and unfortunately it means spending a lot of money on your boat too, but some people are prepared to, you know, just keep experimenting and changing things little by little until they get everything right, and those people tend to do pretty well under OMR.
Would you ever penalise people who have single spreader rigs, because that big spreader then doesn't allow them to have as good an upwind stretch?
Yeah,
all the other people with multiple spreaders
Yeah,
can get them sheeted in closer. Isn't that unfair? So,
exactly right.
you know,
Well, what about the physical weight of a sail? If you've got, say, a 6-ounce stack on a contender sail cloth, and a milo one or a sophisticated modern material one can do it in half the weight.
Yes.
That's a major factor right there. On a big sail, half the weight and probably a better shape.
Yes. However, that weight is partially compensated for by the fact that it's making the boat heavier, and the lighter one gets a higher handicap because the boat's lighter. So, you know, there are some.
But the physical weight, the weight is up high.
Well, that's true. I'm not arguing with that at all.
it's the development.
Yeah, but how to make all that work without causing absolute
Because
mayhem.
that's the engine. Let's face it, that's the engine. Yeah. So that's why I would think that's a pretty critical thing, the weight of the sail. Certainly the efficiencies is really interesting stuff when you think about the history of it. And we all think of specific cases, you can't avoid it. Like the fantastic rating that Rhythmic has had over the years with that lower aspect sail. But the fact that with the better cloths and the better cuts these guys have been able to do, that lower aspect sail is better than a higher aspect sail, you know, from years ago. And that's the difference. And then what you were saying about taking that, you could, if someone else said, oh, well, Phil does well because he's got a low aspect main, I'll go and shot a couple of metres off the top of my mast. I'll buy Mojo, cut 2 off the top and see how I go. It's not going to work on Mojo.
Exactly
right.
Everything's a complete egg of separate stuff.
There's a component to this that is also linked with not foiling but lift. We stay with the concept of screeches, all right? Screeches enable you to power up a lot earlier, and a screecher is not all that much value to you while, and we're talking specifically of cats now, while both hulls are in the water. And there is experience that says that if you've got a using it as an upwind screecher, you're down on height by anywhere from 5 to 7 degrees against a normal setting jib or a Genoa. The moment that you lift that hull, and this is where I think the added complexity needs to come in, which if I can just take this a step further, I've gone through a lot of your work there, Alistair, and you're to be commended on what you've done. And I'd really like to get my hands on it and work with you on it. There's a few other things I think that could be added there to take into consideration the lift. The moment that you lift a hull on a cat, you'll get your height back. And your screecher, be it may an intermediate or a large screecher, is one that will keep you with that hull out of the water, and therefore over a greater range of a race, that boat will excel much further than its OMR rating is really on about at this point in time. So I think you're probably getting onto it, that there's a lift factor that needs to come in, not a foiling factor, but a lift factor that needs to be considered along the lines of power to weight ratio.
You're actually talking about reducing the drag factor rather than a lift factor, though, yeah.
Well, in actual fact,
Well, getting a lift into the wind, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you can lift a hull, then that needs to be accounted for somewhere in the formula as a result of higher powered sails, and especially when you're going to windward.
There's another can of worms.
I've really gone through your formulas there, and it can be done.
Yeah.
Changes on the weight, depending on the wave conditions. It's quite
Well,
Yeah, I think that's the point I'd make on that one. It's probably a fairly small window as to when that becomes an advantage for people. In lighter winds, they're not going to be able to fly a hull. In heavier winds, they're going to be in the same survival mode that everyone else is, sort of thing. And so there's a window where those boats will do well. There's a window where they may not do as well as others. And I guess the risk of putting something in, and I agree with everything you're saying. I'm not saying we wouldn't do it, or future committees wouldn't do it, but it's trying to make sure that you address it across the whole range of racing conditions as well.
I think you can if you bracket it. And there's an example that we've seen in recent times at the winter series up at QCYC, that Extreme 40. It lifts a hull in 8 knots of breeze.
But that's an off the beach cat.
It's a boat that is, hold on a second, it's a boat that is intending on racing against us, and we're still contemplating an OMR formula for it.
Are you going to penalise good design?
No, it's not a case of that. It's trying to take account of a really good design and still keeping it competitive in what it's racing in. At the moment, it's just racing itself, all right? And you know, a lot of people are arguing, how that should be handled. Now, I'm staying away from using the term the performance handicap system. Performance handicap system is meant to take care of differences in crew quality, tactics, and how people sail their boats. And I don't know whether it was Mike or Jeff or Alistair who said it. You're trying to get back to looking at individual groups or individual boats and trying to get the physics of boats somewhat handled by more detailed look at the review. That's really what you're on about, and that's what I commend that you're doing. But we are seeing these high-tech boats coming in who are wanting to compete with us because it's exciting stuff. The America's Cup has demonstrated that. We should expel them from our racing.
And I think the difficulty we really face is if you look at any field, wherever it is, then the rate of improvement in that field becomes exponential. As soon as some improvements happen, they build on the other improvements, and then more and more people get excited, and the rate of improvement just goes exponential. Now in multi-hulls, there's probably been step changes, but from the history that Jeff sort of talked about through till around about now, we haven't had that change to exponential. As we start to try to incorporate boats like an America's Cup boat, Extreme 40s and things, it just goes exponential. Now, I can sit here and say I don't know how the OMR is ever going to compare those boats with the boats like mine and most of the people in the rooms that are a conventional sailing boat that will never foil and never do all of that. I don't know that the OMR is actually going to be the vehicle that works across that. Whether that means those guys have to sail to a whole different division and set of rules, I don't know. I mean, but we're at the risky. Up till now, boats have all behaved pretty much the same. There are now boats that are behaving astronomically different to the other boats, and it's going to be very difficult. And we'll try to make the OMR catch up, but the reality is, once boats start doing that, I just don't know how we'll do it in the OMR.
Having explored and really looked through all the formulas, I think is an excellent start to try and capture that.
But that's certainly the challenge that is ahead, because as more and more of these boats come in, we've got to work out how to start dealing with these exponential changes in behaviour of boats.
And the boat works, yes. Yep. And so where do we stop? This is an offshore multi-hull rule here. So you've got boats with kitchen windows and sinks, and it's all great to compete, but where do we stop with the offshore multi-hull rule when you've got, I want to see sailing and I want to see exciting boats, but where do you stop?
Well, these sort of
where's the stopping point for a boat that is got no kitchen sinks, has to be towed out to the start?
Look, I get.
Because it can't,
We haven't.
it doesn't have enough safety gear on it, so it needs a chase boat to follow it. I mean, that's a different realm altogether.
Yeah, I don't agree with that myself.
And the Extreme 40 hasn't got an OMR yet, but I'm measuring on Monday.
We don't, like,
So-
has it raced on OMR?
No, it hasn't
No.
rated
So we
on OMR.
don't know.
It hasn't got a rating.
Yeah, it's going to have an
So it'll be really interesting to see what the rating is.
Yeah.
I run it through and it comes out about 1.5,
And I'm pretty sure, bit of Marta.
which is pretty much the same as a normal 60.
Just hang on a minute, guys. We're trying to get all of this on video, which is going to be on our website in due course. I don't think the video can cope with this.
Interesting though what Bruce is saying in terms of the drag factor, and it's similar to the discussions we've had on riding moment, because we don't take measurements yet to do anything on riding moment. But if you're talking about that feeling when you pop a hole and the cat does start to point, then you've got the difference in screeches between cats and tries, because the percentage of tries will pop the centre hole is very small. So then you'll have to have a different set of factors between the cats and the tries. So yeah.
Here's a question. If you grab a boat I know, Mad Max, you give VPLP a design window and you say every number must match its current OMR number, and they achieve it, it will blow the current boat out of the water and not a single number will be different.
Yeah.
So how do you account for that?
Yeah.
Yeah, you employed some smart French guys so they get, the French guy factor, I don't know.
But at the end of the day, the OMR is always going to have limitations, and I guess if you look at it as a rule that started off as people at a club level, and that's how Jeff introduced it, trying to sail against their mates and compare themselves, that's still what the OMR is trying to be. Whether it is the vehicle that actually handles all of that development, it remains to be seen whether it can keep up and keep up adequately.
It can try.
With the Extreme 40, then say Phil Day goes out of his boat and he makes a mistake that takes him a minute to fix that mistake.
Yeah.
It gets divided by 0.7, 2, whatever Phil's got. So his mistake's going to get smaller. If the Extreme 40 comes out at 1.5, their minute is going to go to a minute and a half.
Yeah.
None of these guys think about that. So they're going to have a lot of hard time racing us on OMR.
And the reality is their
Because
mistake
they're
probably
gonna make
costs them
a lot
even
of
more time because they've overshot the course or whatever they've done at the speed they're doing.
Yeah, better than that if we all get a better start and all luff it every time.
I'll stand by the fact that if you're on a really quick boat, you can lose a race through a very small mistake.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And if you're on more the bridge deck style boats in the 8s or whatever, you can get away with a fair bit as long as you
can
still
recover from
start
that.
well,
Yeah.
That's just the way it is. The guys on the fast boats aren't going to.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt. It's much harder to sail a fast boat to 100% than it is to sail a slow boat to 100%. But that's just the nature of it.
But you have a lot of fun.
Okay, let's let Alice.
I mean, as a whole, I guess future reviews have to deal with all of these sort of things. we're starting to see it, and it's starting to impact a couple of boats who race occasionally, sort of thing, and it's starting to actually impact the fleet. And future reviews are going to see more and more of that, and it's going to have to be addressed. At the moment, the OMR really is all about getting getting people who sail at the same sort of level and comparing them. And the OMR, being a development rule, will always lag the development, and it's got to develop. So initially, if somebody comes out and they're able to win on those sort of factors, they'll keep winning until the rule catches up with them. That's just the nature of the beast. It's never going to be, or until it all gets a bit much and they go swimming or something. But that's the nature of the OMR. I mean, I'm not saying we won't look at it, and I'd love to sit with you as well and look at those things, but 95% of the boats in the OMR database don't fly hulls and foil and carry screeches to windward and those sort of things. And any change we do make to try to address those 5%, we've got to make sure it doesn't just cause havoc to the other 95% that are sitting in it. Not saying it's not doable, but it's certainly going to get harder. And I don't relish the job of the next person who does this review.
You're permanently
And when you look at the screecher situation, we've had people talking about the fact that some boats can carry screechers to a big advantage. We've had that talk for, I don't know, 10 years, but it's only in the last couple of years that it's actually happened, that actually boats have been able to do it successfully in varying conditions, right? You know, I'd say probably only in the last 3 or 4 years. Prior to that, there'd be boats that, you know, when the angle was exactly right and the conditions were exactly right, the horizon of the fleet on one leg.
Once.
Yeah, once.
Once.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And it's taken a long time for the things to be actually useful.
Consistently.
Yeah, consistently. Yeah.
Just as an aside to the sailmakers, while we've got so many learned colleagues here, the screechers that do work, how long are they lasting?
Depends what you make it out of.
But the screechers that do work, are they any of them holding up? Because when you see them, you can just hear the fabric screaming from the time it's sheeted on.
So it should.
So they're
No, it's
sailmakers that like.
No one's prepared. no one's prepared to say they're not lasting.
You love them.
They're very expensive sails and they're very critical sails. So, you know, we have to try to get people to buy them out of the best possible cloth so that they're light and low stretch.
Yeah, but if they use them once every month,
some of those cloths don't
How long?
last very long.
a year and a half.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Or
By
5
three.
years, or 5 years, mate. It
Yeah.
We have
depends.
screechers coming 8-10 years old.
Right.
They're being used.
But being used upwind.
Well,
Yeah,
they're
probably.
pushed a lot harder than they should be.
No.
My screech is 16 years old. It's great.
They last well in their bags.
But you don't go to windward group.
I don't go to windward with it.
Alistair, with whether a cat flies a hole or whether a try flies 2 holes, is really about the technique of how they're sailing it as well. I mean, you can do it without the screechy, it depends on the wind, of course. But screechers, you get very varied results too. Sometimes they work really well. There's a fairly bright coloured boat that was sailing in the Brisbane to Gladstone that probably covered twice as much distance as everybody else going to the windward mark from the start. It went quite fast, but I don't think it really went.
The very same boat came second in a national using that thing up to 15 knots. So
Yeah.
with different individuals and pulling the halyard tight. But it's very critical is what I'm
way
saying.
it was sailed or whatever. Yeah.
Well, you're right, because it's a lot of discipline to sail a boat that's accelerating like that upwind, because the apparent just keeps taking you over, and
keeps
before
going
you know it,
forward.
you're down at 80 degrees. So, you know, you can lose out.
Having a load of fun, but going the wrong way. Okay, we'll keep moving along, but there's time for discussion. We don't want to just focus on a single aspect, but just to sort of round it up, we are into the last couple of slides here. Along the way, so they're the sort of I guess, technical, call it, changes that were made to the rule. Along the way, just for completeness, I'll list what sort of administrative changes. So the spreadsheet, I don't know the sort of the genesis of that spreadsheet, but it's obviously been around a while, and a lot of people have hacked into it, and I, for one, found it always very difficult to interpret and look at, and you had to sift through all sorts of trial data and things like that. So along the way, we've tidied the spreadsheet right up and tried to make that more user-friendly, and I hope people find that that's the case. And also locked all the formulas down for security, because only certain people had access to the spreadsheet previously, but and normally it would be accidentally, you would hope, but it doesn't take much to override a number and end up with something wrong, or a number hard-coded where it should have been attached to a formula or something like that. So hopefully the security is a lot better, and when I did go through and made that change, it's actually surprising how many numbers I did find that were hard-coded in the old spreadsheet, overwritten a formula or something. Now, most of them, there was no change, but a couple did actually make a slight change. So if your boat has an unexplained change, that might be it. So the next thing was that the rating has always been intended to have a validity period of 4 years. Now, obviously, it's pretty hard to achieve that. There's a lot goes into, particularly with a bigger boat, weighing it and measuring everything and all of that. But we do want to keep trying to enforce that validity, because, boats do change over time, particularly with the weight and things like that. Sail stretch, whatever, all these sort of things happen. So if you start to get pedantic about the numbers, you really have to be pedantic about getting the accurate, up-to-date sort of numbers into the system as well. So the spreadsheet now colour codes boats, so a lot of people might have seen their boat now comes up orange or red sort of thing. Well, I think it's yellow or orange actually. So the yellow is it's between 4 and 6 years old, and the red is it's more than 6 years and really shouldn't be out there racing. The yellow is a bit of a grace period in a way to get a rating up. So effectively you have 6 years validity. The intent is to keep it at 4, but you've got that 2-year grace if you need to use it. Now, if you refer back to the preamble, it's up to the owner of the boat or the skipper of the boat to make sure that their records are up to date. When I did send out the new spreadsheet, had all these people come back and say, oh, my boat's name's changed and blah, blah, this has changed and that's changed and all of that. Now, that's all good. We'll tidy up as much as we can, but it's not... I will say that some of the emails were quite accusatory about these changes always get ignored. Now, some of that is real, but some of it's false. I mean, it's the owner's... If a boat's had the wrong name in the spreadsheet for 4 years, it's not my problem that boat has a wrong name. The owner's been looking at it for 4 years sort of thing. So it is up to people to keep their boat up to date and to know that their rating's up to date, and so the new spreadsheet is designed to help people with that. The other change in the spreadsheet for people who are sailing in fleets and getting worried about what other boats are doing is the spreadsheet now says what sail configuration each boat is actually rated for. Before, it was very hard to work out without sort of going right into the back of the spreadsheet, to work out whether a boat was rated with a spinnaker or not. And you might say, well, I didn't think that he was rated with a spinnaker, but there he is on the race course with a spinnaker up, sort of thing. The spreadsheet now has up at the front end what the sail configuration is. So if you go in there and have a look, you'll see some boats will have main and jib and screecher. That's what they're rated for. If they're flying a spinnaker, they're not sailing under OMR anymore, because they're not rated to have a spinnaker. So if people do want to be doing checks, I mean, I hate that sort of thing more than most people perhaps, but people looking at what other people are doing. But again, it's up to each person to make sure that their boat is appropriate. If your boat is in there with a main, a jib and a screecher and you use a spinnaker, it's up to you to get that spinnaker into the rating and make sure that it's there. But now there's a little code up the front to help you understand what that is, and maybe to help your fellow sailors understand how you should be sailing. Now, I don't think that's going to apply to many boats, but there were a couple that stood out to me that I think are sailing differently to how they're rated.
Can I just butt in
Yeah.
for a second? One of the important things about being rated every 4 years or so is that not so much that that boats change, they do a little bit, but it also helps us correct any mistakes that were made in the original rating. I've recently remeasured a couple of boats. In 2 cases, their spinnakers were incorrectly measured in that they were 2 metres, or one was 2 metres longer on the luff than it actually was, which obviously wasn't, it hadn't grown that much. Sailmakers, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't really think they stretched that much. And the other one was over a metre longer on its luff. So it had obviously been incorrectly measured in the first place, and the poor buggers were carrying these huge ratings because the spinnaker was measured much bigger than it actually was. So it's definitely in your interest to check on those things. If normally we get the owner or his representative to sign off on the measurements when they're done, but you know, if you're not really taking too much notice, you can easily slip in a 13 where a 15 should have been, or maybe when they're translated from spreadsheet or from paperwork to spreadsheet, it goes from, it looked like a 13 on the paperwork, so or it looked like a 15 when it should have been a 13. So it's important to keep an eye on these things for yourself as well, and at least after 4 years, if you get it redone again, you'll be able to correct that. By then, of course, you probably should have 3 or 4 new spinnakers.
The boats up at Pointy End that ideally measuring all the time to
Yes.
measuring every year.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. Almost all the guys are very, very keen at that sharp end.
Mike's always on the menu.
Yeah, that's right. To get their sales right. Yeah.
The challenge I have with that sort of stuff, particularly at our inclusive races, which we want to build because inclusive is good. Bay to bay, 30 boats turn up, 25 OMR, and they say, oh yeah, I've got a rating, and they like Triumph, gone to Bundaberg, yeah, I've got a rating. All right, what are you using? Oh, all the sails that are on it, they've all been rated. Yeah, okay, and so we have those, and I think, I don't know how we're going to do it, but when Cruzy sells me a car, there's a specific process with the rego.
Which one of my cars do you want?
You sign off the registration, it goes to me and I sign off. You know, there's a process and there's money involved and all that sort of stuff. When we sell our boats, we've got to be a bit more responsible, I think, the way we do it. I don't know what the club can do with that as well, to make sure that the new owner is very quickly addressed to what's going on. Because often they'll sail for a year or two, no, I'm not going to do, no, I'm never going to do OMR, and all of a sudden they turn up. Yeah, I'm doing OMR. Oh, what's your crew weight? What do you want the weight for? And that was a question I had in the boat. What do you want the crew weight for? You know, my daughter's not going to tell you how heavy she is. So, you know, we have that in the inclusive races. So anything we can do to address that.
Yeah, look, that's a very good point, Peter. And I think the way to do that is, originally, OMR didn't allow the transfer of ratings. You had to re-rate your boat if you changed hands. I think we probably don't need to go to that extent, but what we should say is that if you want your boat to remain OMR once it's, if you bought another boat, then you have to get in touch with us, give us all your details and so on, and at least become conversant with what's going on. And I think that's probably something we should find out. The trouble is that we don't know if you've sold your boat.
You don't ring us up and say,
fantastic because it's active and it's a single point of truth.
Yeah.
But your beautiful bit of paper that was green and white stripes
Yeah.
had that official feel about it.
Yeah, that's right.
When you sold the boat, you handed it on, a bit of glue on it and crossed through that sail and that blew up. Your responsibility is to fix that. So either of those have their advantages.
A bit of a segue on that is the point of contact for all the administration. So what I guess before people would email Zeb, or they'd email Mike, or they'd email me or Peter or somebody, Jeff, and a bit loose. What I've done, and I do apologise for the process this was done in, as I've set up an OMR email. I then promptly went overseas for a couple of weeks without internet access and didn't tell anyone about it and couldn't access it myself. So apologies for the people who did write to that email address. I have got back to most of them now, but it did go a bit quiet for a while. But what we'll try to do is get the people who need it access to that email so that anyone can use that as a point of contact and a single collection point for data. So we'll need to work on how we improve that a little bit, but that's the intent there. Along a similar line, and this is still probably in the intent phase rather than in the reality, but we are looking at how to build a cloud database of inventories and things like that, so that we actually have access to all these forms and things, so that if you want to check somebody's inventory at a race meeting in Airlie Beach, then you can just pull it up on your computer and have a look, sort of thing. So that's the intent of where we'd like to get to. It's possibly not going to get there straight away, but that's where we're trying to head. What we have done is updated the preamble. So the preamble, the new spreadsheet, are all uploaded to the website now. The intent is still that the website is always the point of truth, sort of thing, to use Peter's words. And along the way in this process, we've generated a mailing list of OMR skippers, so people should have been getting these sort of emails out. If you haven't, let us know. It's been a hard process, actually, that, because up till now they've just been in people's private emails, sort of thing. So we're trying to pull that together as a database of interested people, rather than just OMR skippers, but interested people who should be told about changes with OMR and things like that. So if you haven't been getting emails about the changes, then let me know, because your email address won't be on that list. So I guess just trying to summarise quickly, we've sort of talked about a few things along the way, but just pull it all together. This is the last couple of slides now. I think I said that before as well. So the overall impact of the changes, we have been able to look at, obviously, the really good race data that we had from Airlie Beach, Hamilton Island, but that was only a cross-section of the boats that are in the overall database as well. But we've looked at the Surf to City, the Brisbane to Gladstone, those sort of things, how the old OMR did, how the new OMR did. On the whole, we haven't been too surprised with the results. We've been quite pleased with the new MR treats it better. If anything, I guess I said at the start, we weren't trying to fix all the problems straight away and leap straight to the final answer. It's always going to be a path that you follow. If anything, we may not have gone far enough in some of the things. Now, that's contrary to some of the feedback I've heard where people have said, like, for example, a sail efficiency, removing it completely seems to be a step too far. But when you're looking at what we're actually trying to do, close the gaps, it actually hasn't closed the gap as far as we might like. So that's potential for future reviews and things to keep working on that process. But overall, it looks good. What we needed to do, all the sort of changes, going back to the philosophy of the statistics, playing with statistics and playing with factors and things generally won't actually reorder the boats in a race. It might bring the corrected times closer. At times it will reorder, obviously, because of the combination of factors that come in. So if you make a change that really impacts that sort of the three different coefficients in a certain way, it can reorder the results. But what we've tried to do, but by just trimming factors and coefficients, that doesn't necessarily happen. What we've tried to do by addressing particular anomalies and make a sort of step change in a particular area is introduce changes into the process that will actually reorder the fleet at times rather than just bring the results closer. We've certainly seen that when you run back over things like the Brisbane to Gladstone race from this year. Now, Brisbane to Gladstone is always a tricky one because you do have tidal effects at the end, different races all the way along the race course, all of that sort of stuff. So it's hard to say that it's a nice consistent set of data. Airlie Beach and Hamo are much better, where it's a couple of hours, everyone goes out, same time, same wind, same tide, all of that sort of stuff. Sort of, unless they don't. But what we have seen is that it's reordered the results in a way that agrees with what perception would be, and that the boats that possibly people thought shouldn't have been doing as well as they did get pushed back, and boats that did actually sail really well and sail to the boat's potential, not just well, are being rewarded a bit more under the new system. So it certainly looks to be doing what we're trying to do, but I'm not going to say it's perfect, and we need to address some areas still. There's still room for improvement, room for review, and continuously seeking feedback and real data. I mean, I guess we say that every time we do sort of these reviews. It's easy to say, it doesn't work for this reason, but what we really want to know is what were the conditions on that day, what were the race results you're talking about, did everyone sail well on that day, or can we ignore that data point because that person just had a shocker, or what sort of thing is it? Because unless you've got that real life data, not just a set of numbers, it's hard to really map it out. And that, again, is the advantage we had from Early Beach, is that Mike had been there and a lot of other people had been there who we valued the input of, sort of thing. So always seeking that. After particularly removing the sail efficiencies moves all of the OMRs up, so that would just surprise people and make people sort of have to learn a whole new paradigm sort of thing of where things were. So the factor at the front of the OMR equation is designed to address that. So that factor has then been changed to bring everything back so that the average of the whole database is the same as what it was before. Doesn't mean that every boat's the same, obviously, but the average is some boats will have gone up, some boats will have gone down, but all in all, the average of the whole database was 7 to 1 or something previously, or higher than that, I think. But anyway, it's the same average now. So if your rating has gone up, you've been adversely affected by these changes. If your rating has gone on the whole, if your rating has gone down, you've been positively impacted by these changes on the whole. But really, I guess what each person wants to know is how they've gone compared to the boat that they typically race against, or their peer, the guy they're trying to beat. So everyone's going to look at that. Some people are going to be happy, some people are going to be upset with how that is. But at the end of the day, that's where it falls out of these changes that are in there. When you look at how it does work, what I've got as a graph that I guess tries to pictorially say everything that I've said in the last while. The top line here, this is add up for the boats that did all of... I'll start again. For Early Beach and Hamilton Island Race Week, for every race, what we did is took a reference boat in the fleet and compared the finishing time to that reference boat for every single race and got a factor. So in race 1, they might have been 90% as fast as the reference boat. Race 2, they might have been 93% as fast in the elapsed time. We added up those factors and averaged out those factors for all of the races to arrive at a relative speed ranking for the boats for all of those races. So the top line up there is the relative speed ranking of all of the boats. In the middle there, at 1, it's the reference boat, and then there are boats that are 1.4 times as fast as a reference boat, down to boats that are 0.85 times as fast as a reference boat over those 15 races. So that's an attempt to actually just sort of see what the speed potential is of each boat in that fleet. The bottom line is the OMR, how it was on the old system. Now, of course, it's 15 races, which is a good start, but it's not a complete data set. But you would expect that the OMR line would have the same shape, maybe not necessarily the same gradient, but at least the same shape as the speed line. And what you can see is that there are some real anomalies that are in there. So there are a couple of pronounced dips over to the left. Those are boats that have an OMR a lot lower than the speed that they actually sail around those race courses and the speed they demonstrated. Then there's a pretty big spike and another big spike over to the right. They're boats with high OMRs that should have done well and didn't. They just weren't there on speed. Now, some of those we can explain, some factors, but really this goes back to the philosophy I guess we had at the start, is picking out what are the boats in the dips and what are the boats in the troughs, and what are the boats in the peaks, and what do they have in common, and what factors do we need to change. When we finished the whole process, there's a number of lines in there that just represent each individual change. Don't worry about trying to follow the whole thing. But what we're trying to say is that there were a couple of really big dips in here. We've now built that dip up. This peak, we weren't too worried about. That boat didn't sail its potential and we know why. We weren't trying to necessarily address it. Some boats that may not have needed addressing particularly got addressed. That's just an artefact of how it happened. This one could have lifted but didn't. That just means that none of these changes actually apply to that boat. But what we were really happy to see is that some of these boats that have a very favourable RMR have now started to level out. And this is where I guess I said it may appear that we haven't actually gone far enough in this review, but we've certainly gone some way to matching that profile a bit closer. As I said, don't worry about that big spike in the middle. I'll leave people to guess what boat that is, but it's a boat with quite a high OMR rating that just wasn't sailing to its rating that week. But otherwise, it's become a flatter line than it was, which indicates that the changes are in the right direction. Arguably, it could become flatter still, but you'll never get it completely accurate. Some people just made good decisions in the races, some people made bad decisions and things, and that'll impact the results. There'll always be blips, but this is just trying to level out the blips that consistently appear when you look at these races, any other races, those sort of things. So I guess that's what we've been trying to do. Using that as a measure, it appears that we've been successful. Time will tell as we get more and more data to look in. So we've had some questions along the way, but if there's anything else people want to ask about or discuss or throw out there, more than happy to take it. Jeff is more than happy to take it.
Anything specific, I think Alice is looking for?
Has there been any consideration for an age allowance? And the reason why I'm asking that is that there are a lot of boats that are sitting at marinas that could race, but are old in design. Let's not talk about sail efficiencies. They have the ability, if they want to race, to get the right sails on. But their shape is just not where the modern racer is.
Yeah. No, I think there is some merit in that, and I know that the guys in Thailand who while they work under OMR, I think they feel that they own the Thailand OMR into themselves. They are talking about an age factor for their fleet, and they've had quite a bit of discussion about it. A difficulty I see, and I haven't gone through it fully, but a difficulty I see is what aspect do you rate the age of? And I'll use my boat as an example. It's a 16-year-old boat, but the mast and the sails are brand new. So I've got, in theory, leading edge, or not, maybe not leading, I didn't pay that much, but I've got my sailmaker's sitting in the room. I've got in theory, quite a good rig and sails on an older hull. So which bit do I get penalised for, sort of thing? So that's just an issue I see with it. But
you could consider taking a leap out of the monohulls rating system, the IORC or the IRC, and I've spent a fair bit of time in that. And there is a sliding factor associated with age allowance that takes into effect that point that you just raised. You can put above your decks, modernise, but below the decks, it's a lot more effort to change that.
Yeah.
So even if you have changed the boat, you still get that age allowance, like
It's a sliding scale. If you've left it untouched, and there is a boat that I'll quote in the monohulls that has done very well recently, and that's Wild Rose in the Sydney to Hobart system, has done virtually nothing to it and has held maximum age allowance. Other boats have tinkered with it and have lost some of their percentage of age allowance. And it has made a relatively even playing field for those older boats that still want to be competitive.
Yeah, it's certainly something to consider. I guess from the sound of it, it adds an administrative burden, but anything will. But yeah, it's certainly something to think about.
Again, looking at the spreadsheet that you have expanded and developed, it could be included.
Is it when it's designed or when it's built? Mod 70 is 10 years old. Yeah. We've just designed a boat and made a build, and it's not going to be as fast as Mod 70. It's not going to be as efficient as Mod 70. So, age doesn't really matter. Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting aspect.
It's another 10 years old.
Yeah, but you look at a boat like Top Gun as well. I mean, it's one of the oldest boats, multi-hull sailing around, still racing, and yet it's right at the front edge. So.
And XL2 will be there as well.
XL2's got a pretty big rig, bigger than that in the first place.
Only a little bit.
So the factors that you went through today, are they just the ones that changed, or are they the factors that the whole thing's based on?
No, they're the things that have changed in this review. Yeah.
Did you put any time into looking at boats that could come in that might be a bit odd? Foils are one of the ones, but cat rig boats that have no jib, or boats that have no screecher or spinnaker.
Yeah, we had quite a discussion on several of those aspects. I guess, to me, and if anyone wants to dive in deep, but to me, it's still, the rule always has to lag behind. If we see a boat like that actually racing and generating data, we can start to look at it, but we're not going to try to predict what a boat might do and predict a rule before it's actually out there racing. So
just remember a couple of times playing around with what would happen if we didn't use a jib, or we didn't use a kite at all.
Yeah, and look, there are anomalies in the spreadsheet, and we have tried to
close up a few of those, particularly some of the boats with different size spinnakers and screechers and things like that. I've actually corrected the intent of some of the equations at the back end of the sheet. And if you read the preamble, it lays out quite clearly what the intent is, but the spreadsheet may not have actually done that. Hopefully we've fixed up a few of those sort of things. I'm not going to tell people what they are, but there are loopholes, and there are still loopholes that I know that people could do in their sail wardrobe. But I guess we've just got to try to get on top of those people and say, well, look, really, are you using that sail as a sail, or is it just there for your rating or something like that? But yeah, we'll try to stay on top of all those things. And the way to address some of those is not necessarily in the formulas, but in the preamble, where it says what you can and can't do. Sort of thing.
Yeah, the preamble normally gives you the intent, and it also gives the whoever's looking after the rule the ability to say, you're fired, because that's not what it was meant to do.
Yeah.
I don't think we've done that, but although somebody at one stage put a little extension on one of their screeches, I think it was, with a little fluttering bit, and to try and get that through.
I remember that.
Yeah, didn't last one.
The IRC leave it right down to a certain point to decide what downwind wardrobe they're going to take, and they might have an allowance of 3 or 4.
Yeah.
And with these performance boats coming in, there will come a point where we go back to a windy airlie a few years ago, or you don't sail with any downwind sails,
Yeah.
So it probably will start popping up, people utilising those.
Over the years, we've talked about having to declare your sales a week or two beforehand, haven't we? That's one
cut-off date. IRC is like a week and a half, something out from the Southport race.
I think the biggest trouble we had with the cut-off date when we had that Manly series a few years ago was that some of you guys hadn't built the sails in time.
It's always the sailmaker's fault, not the fact that the bloke ordered it 2 days beforehand.
I ordered it a week ago.
Plenty of time.
Okay, no more questions?
Just another one. If you do an expansive review of the old OMR, or the previous one, and this one, you actually see some interesting comparisons just on raw OMR without crew weight correction. All the high performance cats and tries have all generally come down in their OMR rating. And all of the smaller, lower performing cats have actually gone up, and the variation is almost the same either side of those two categories. It's about 1 to 2% with some outliners. One being the old Boatworks, the red one, got hammered by 4%, and the one of the tries went skyrocketed by almost 7%. So I don't know how.
Which one?
I want that boat.
Very justified.
No, it actually.
Which boat was that, Bruce?
Hammered by 7%.
Oh, hammered.
It was New Horizon or someone. I can't remember. It was one of those boats. Anyway, the general comment that I'm trying to make is that when you look at those high performing tries and cats, and I'll name them at the moment, which has been Morticia, Frequent Flyer, and Mad Max, have come down, yet they're always out there in how they perform in races in terms of results, and that seems to go against what the general fraternity feeling is about the OMR rating. And the flip side of that is the boats that have had their OMR rating increased have not really been able to compete on OMR. That's a general comment in perusing the old versus new.
Well, no,
I think more
Sorry?
the other way. Yeah.
Yeah, I disagree with you there because, you know, to start with, one of the things we looked at OMR handicaps compared to performance handicap, right? Now, if you look at a list of OMR handicaps and against performance handicaps, what you see is that the boats at the top end, you know, Mad Max, Malice, bloody, whatever that other thing is. Boats that have a OMR around about 1 have a performance handicap that's nearly the same, right? Very close. But as you go down the list, you get down to, you know, Renaissance and Hasta La Vista, where the gap between the OMR and the performance handicap is like 15%.
Yeah.
And so what that's saying is that the boats with the high OMRs, right, aren't sailing to their rating. They're not sailing to their OMR rating, because that performance rating that they've got, that's what they're sailing to.
I suppose I was referring only to OMR. I'm not, and I take your point, and I've observed that as well. When you compare OMR to performance handicap, that's exactly what you see. I'm not even taking performance handicap into consideration. This is purely an OMR discussion.
No, but I'm just using the performance handicap as a comparison.
Yeah, well,
because that is a handicap derived from all your performances, actual performances, right? And when you look at the Airlie Beach and Hamilton Island last year, well, Mojo won at Airlie Beach and Chilpill won at Hamilton Island. And so, and they were racing against, you know, Mad Max and Morticia and the like. And the weather should have suited those boats down to the ground. The high rating boats. Because it was like no more than 15 knots any day. Almost no sea.
You're kidding.
No.
We had one reef in a couple of days and we're looking for more. There's more than 15.
Yeah, but you're a still.
Hold on, mate.
So I'm prepared to share the list.
They put a reef in 15 knots. Yeah.
And I agree with you, Bruce. There are some boats who people perhaps would have wanted to see move who haven't moved, and if anything have moved in the opposite direction. And I know two boats that have done that are quite high profile boats. What they're saying is that these changes that we've made didn't impact those boats. Now we were trying to look for changes that we could make to address as many of the anomalies as we could. What it means, speaking fairly openly, I guess, we were trying to bring those boats back in line, but we couldn't identify an underlying aspect of the formula, the effect of that boat that we could change that would bring it back without just making something up just to target a particular boat. So the difficulty we face is trying to put logic and reasoning behind the changes that we've made to try to target those particular boats is difficult at the moment in the spreadsheet. And the boats you talked about are the ones that I'm talking about as well. Frequent flying Morticia haven't been impacted by these rules, and yet they predominantly win a lot of races on OMR. That's not going to change. This review hasn't addressed that. If we can work out a way to address that without actually just novelling that boat, ideally we would like to, but we haven't been able to identify the factor in those boats. Now, the commonality in those two boats, the frequent flyer and Morticia, is that they have been optimised to within an inch of their life overall. They do sail with a very analytical crew in both of them, and they do everything they can to win races. Now,
One of the
that means, those factors mean that those boats actually should be winning under OMR.
One of the
So we haven't been able to peg those boats back, but maybe we shouldn't be pegging them back either. That's
Yeah, there's an argument both ways, but I think there is scope now in there, and I've mentioned it already that this evening is one of this lift or popping a hole. I think that's a factor that can be put in there, and obviously as it moves further forward to boiling cats, if they ever enter the OMR arena, that can be taken to that level as well.
Yep. No, certainly know that.
Alistair, what about the width of boats? There's a line up the top of the sheet that doesn't seem to be taken into account anywhere, and that has an influence over the riding.
Just so we can get you into a marina. No, honestly, that's why it's there. Because often we're required to give the marinas the width of your boat so they know where to put you.
But it must have an influence over the writing line.
Well, it may just mean that if you're a narrow boat, you can pop a hull quicker.
Yes, that's true.
It's pretty complicated, that, isn't it? Like, for years, I raced Trilogy, and I think one of the strengths was it wasn't at either end of the OMR scale, well, and had a bit of weight, which the rule liked, but it was nice and wide without too big a rib. And then for Remington's boat, the numbers in the spreadsheet weren't hugely different. It was a lot narrower and a lot less volume, and there's definitely certain boats where they can get advantage that's not covered by the pool, but it goes both directions.
I think that's very true. I'm sure you'll find that some boats, given a particular wind strength and sea state and what, will do really, really well, and take them out of that, and they don't do quite so well. I noticed, particularly with sailing against Trilogy, that as soon as we got into a bit of a chop, Trilogy just walked away from us because of the shape of the hulls and the length and a bit of weight and so on. I was on bare essentials at the time, and most of the time we were a little bit faster, but getting into the chop was just not good.
Just to address that a little bit more, a lot of people say, why doesn't it have led to width and hull width type measure in there? And in fact, that's really what is at the heart of the OMR, it's the length to displacement when it comes in through the length and the weight. So the fact that it isn't in OMR is more about the shape of the hull, and that's the one that's probably harder to do something about. The length to displacement actually gets catered for by the length, weight, and the two factors that apply to each of those. It actually becomes the length to displacement ratio of those two numbers. But what it doesn't account for is the shape. You could have a very narrow, deep shape or a very wide, flat bottom shape that had the same displacement. The OMR will actually see those two as the same thing. So it's the shape. So it depends whether it comes in as hull width or hull depth below the water. And you could make very...
necessarily talking about a hull of one hull. Each hull, whether you've got two or three, but the overall width and the influence that has. If you look, what's the width of the extreme 40?
Not very extreme.
Or something.
Yeah, it looks very wide when it's coming towards you at speed. And it will probably be able to carry its enormous reef a lot longer because of that.
In actual fact, I did the figures on the Extreme 40. It has a maximum apparent wind where it pops its hull at about 16 knots. Apparent. Whereas you have an approximate apparent of about 23 knots, I think.
Like to see that.
So that's why you can fly a hull in 6 knots.
Yes.
It's also why in 8 knots he probably has to put a reef in.
That boat's going to be incredibly hard to manage in a hammer sort of situation in sort of over 15, 18 knots.
I would think in gusty conditions.
It's already, I've seen a range of angles that cannot even sail. So, everything that gets an advantage at one end of the spectrum loses it massively at the other. So,
They call it gas
Okay, well, we will call it. So, look, I'd just like to thank everyone for coming tonight, show some interest, particularly our sail makers. I think it's very important you guys came tonight. And it's obvious from the slides and the information that we've got tonight just how hard these guys on the review committee have worked, and I'd like to thank you once again. So, this video will be edited in due course and put on our website, and we'll be sending a link to that to everyone who has an OMR. And so feel free to look through it again, and watching it several times might help to clear some of those things in your own mind. So anyway, I guess what we have to do now is to get out there and sail our boats to the best of our abilities, see how the numbers turn out under the revised rule. And guys have already said that we're going to look at time to
So those new numbers are actually performing now? Or?
Yeah, this came into effect on the 1st of July. So, the semi-penny racing that's been done since the 1st of July, the results will work out.
And believe me, we do want to get feedback from you. Don't feel that we don't be reticent in suggesting things. We certainly like it to be well thought out, but any suggestions or inquiries are always welcome. It's not, don't feel that we're unapproachable.
Okay, call the meeting closed. The bar is open. There's coffee and tea and hot food, all of that.
And applause.
Feel free.